before we get started on painting the miniature, we're going to do a review on what colors that we need to paint our Rivet Warrior. See, it's a pretty limited palette. There's the basic green. We're going to mix this in to lighten that. This will be our ultimate highlight color. Now here's a review on the brushes. We have at the bottom a number 4 flat. We've got a couple of number 8 rounds. One of them is a little bit newer, a little bit better of a point. We have another one that's seen a little action. I'll show you how to use that later. Then we have a liner brush with a pink handle. That one's also seen some use. That's going to be our glazing brush. And then finally the black handle brush is a Winsor Newton, and that's what we're going to use for our detail. To start off with any miniature, you need to prime it. I like brush-on primers. Normally use white. We'll also use black, but in the case of this Rivet Wars Ally, I used NATO Green. It's a surface primer from Vallejo. When you're painting your Rivet Warrior, you want to do most of it with the larger number 4 flat brush. Why? That's so we can cover as much area as quickly as possible. You can see there's a lot of, well, large flat surfaces also. The face, the helmet, his coat. We want to cover these surfaces as quickly as possible so that we can compare our colors. So let's get down to it. We're going to take some of this Vallejo. Sorry, this is a Reaper green. I think it's actually a field green. I'm going to mix a little bit of this Vallejo game color with it. You can see on the palette, I try to leave myself a little range of colors instead of just dabbing away at once. I've got kind of a darker, a middle, and a light. I want these right there in front of me. So I'm going to start off with my basic layer. And you can already see how different that green looks from the palette. It looked really, really dark. And now when we actually start to paint the miniature, well, it doesn't look quite so dark anymore because we're already working on that green primer. It's one of the reasons I primed it that way. So I'm just going to cover all the surfaces that I know will be green. See how nice this flat brush covers that. This is a resin miniature, by the way, and it is obviously about 20mm scale. Probably one of the more unusual miniatures that you'll ever see, which makes it very fun. Alright, so we have that initial layer. Now because I used a bigger brush and I've been working relatively quickly, you can see that all that paint is still wet. Which means I can go back into, now I'm going to get my somewhat lighter color, and we're going to start to put our next layer down. And this is almost going to be wet into wet blending. See, I'm not terribly worried about being careful here. It's more about kind of working fast, kind of free and easy. Especially with these Rivet Wars miniatures. They really do give you some freedom. So there's that layer. Now I'm going to go back in. Make this a little bit lighter. Start off with the helmet again. And you can see it's letting me blend that wet into wet. And even at this stage, if you see a few uneven areas, well, that's okay, because as you saw by the sample, we're going to do a little bit of weathering in places. So like right here, that's where we're going to do some weathering. Don't get all hung up about everything being perfect, or you don't like it. Now let's go back to our original color and do that. Another handy thing about working fast and working wet into wet, almost a little bit like oil paints. And I'm lightening up the jacket in certain places. And I'm not really going to get hung up on super details at this point. It's just we're going to work fast. Even a little bit lighter. Back to the top of the helmet. You can see this paint dries pretty fast. It's already almost totally dry. So, since I have that color out on the palette, I can go back and reclaim that. And again, able to work wet into wet. And you can see this flat brush, what it lets me do is, it's almost a little bit like I'm dry brushing. It's not quite dry brushing, because you can see there's a fair amount of pigment on there. But the soft bristles, let me do a little bit, I call it damp brushing. There's paint on the brush, but you're not full blast laying down an opaque layer of paint that's very wet. So we're going to go around the rim of the helmet here. Make it a little bit lighter. And yeah, we're still going to shade this darker. We're still going to do weathering. So don't worry about everything being 100% perfect. Back to the jacket. You can see how I've been working on the palette here. This is really, it's a very important thing. I have all my colors laid out here. Instead of just working from a little jar of green, from a little jar of that yellow, you can see I can go back and forth at will, whenever necessary. If something, well, maybe it's a little bit too light, I can go right back into my middle, I can go right back into my dark. And that's how I don't get hung up on mixtures, percentages, 100% of this with 80% of that and 30% of that gets a little hard to remember after a while. It's a little easier to remember three things: dark, middle, light. And I know I mixed a little more yellow on my lighter layers, a little less on the darker. Now we're almost, I don't want to get too yellow here. I'll make sure I don't get too yellow. So here we are on the top of the helmet. This obviously is going to get probably the lightest color. Even the jacket will not be as light as this. You can see I'm working on the rim of the helmet here. Rim, top of the helmet. Sorry about that. Here's another little trick I like. Is the thumb. I'll do this intentionally, especially with washes. I'll do this and I'll actually mix it with my thumb, or I'll pull away paint with my thumb. Because what happens if you go, oops, like that? Well, colors out on the palette. Little thumb, paint, back to the light. And there you go, fixed. So back to the jacket. Hit the top of the shoulder, hit around the top of the collar. And if you wanted to get a little bit lighter with this, see we've got our light kind of seafoam green. I think it is called Highlight U.S. Marine Corps. Let's mix this in here and we're going to get our highlight color. So back to the rim of the helmet. Now this is a little more of a pure dry brush here. You can see we did that rim. We'll do the back. We're not going to go all the way around the rim. We're just going to do the front and the back. Back to the shoulder. I'm going to hit this collar I want this to be actually a little bit lighter. Okay, for now, that's how far we're going to take our greens, because we want to work on the face here. Because again, remember how the green primer versus our first layer of green, how that looked different? Well, we want the same thing with our flesh tone. So here is that, I think that's brown rose from Vallejo. Now we're not going to go in and go boom like that, because that just, oof, that's chalky, that's nasty. So what we're going to do is we're going to take some of that field green, and we're going to mix that with the brown rose. Hopefully you can see that. And that is going to be our first layer. So you can see that's a lot more toned down. And that's something I really like to do with my miniatures, is mix the other existing colors, especially with my flesh tones. Because flesh tones tend to, they're not quite like metal, but they do reflect whatever clothes you're wearing, whatever color is in the immediate area. So let's do a little comparison here. We've got face. This is all kind of mostly one flat color. What would have happened if we had just stuck with the pink? And that's just obviously way too pink, which is why we toned it down with some of the green. Besides, these guys probably have some 5 o'clock shadows anyway. And the little hands, same thing. You can see how very careful I'm being. It's so important to stay on the edges. Actually, it's not, because that's why we're going to use this big brush. It's going to kind of liberate you thought-wise. You're not going to think, oh, I have to do just this little blade right here, just this little thing of hair. Nope, we're going to work much bigger than that. Alright, so the face, mostly there. You can see we're going to mix now. We're going to get a little bit lighter. I mixed a little bit of that US Marine Corps in with the flesh tone so that it got lighter, but not day glow pink. So here we're going to start to work on the face. Now, you notice the first place I went to was here, right around where the mouth is, between the eyes. We're going to mostly leave this area alone, and this area alone. This is going to be our shadow area back here. All I'm going to do is pick out the ears, and maybe this bottom part of the face, so you can see how much lighter that is. We don't want to get too light too fast, as it'll look chalky, or it'll just, he's not going to look very much like a guy who's been out on the battlefield for a while. Again, most of the light's concentrating in the center part where the mouth is. Don't worry about the eyes yet, that happens later. Put a little bit of the light under the hands. Actually, I'm going to let that go for right now, let it dry a little bit. We need to put some browns in here, something for the hair. You can see I got my brown, my Vallejo chocolate brown. Again, a little bit of green. And then with that brown, so it's not quite, it's a little less pure, a little more grayed down. Let's go to the hair. Again, this is just the base coat here. Don't have to be too crazy. Even if it leaks over onto the flesh tone, that's fine. We're still going to be working on the flesh tone. You can see, even though it's kind of seen some use, it still has a fine chisel point, just as fine as that helmet, and the edge on the helmet. But this broad surface, you can see it let me work the whole helmet, and it's let me work really fast on the hair. Now, of course, depending on what color hair that you want your guys to have, whether it's blonde or red or whatever, I just wanted to stick with as limited a palette as possible for this video. I'm going to brush a little bit of that brown onto his, not a Springfield rifle, but some kind of rifle. Okay, let's get some brown on these pouches. Now you're going to see me for the first time, I'm actually going to wash my brush. Yes, look, it's a clean brush. Okay, now I'm going to go more to pure brown. Now let's do some of these. Cartridge case. Set the brush on edge, and some belts. Since I haven't done all that fine little detail yet, again, if something goes where it's not quite supposed to, that's okay. A couple little pouches here. And I want some of this on his weapon. Okay. I'm going to do a few little touches of this brown in his hair. Not everywhere, just every so often. I want that to have a little bit more. Now, there's another principle. See how this is kind of a cooler, it's more of a gray brown, warmer brown. This is really an important principle. And here's how we can make that brown even warmer. So we've got some of that tan in with the brown. Well, guess what? We're going to throw some of that on the hair now. Again, just like I picked out certain, I'm only going to pick out certain areas to put this color. I'm not going to put this on the pouches because I want that brown to be a little bit more reddish. And the hair's going to be a little more blonde. And just like I did with the greens over here, you can see we're getting this dark middle white. And again, everything does not have to be perfect at this point. Put a little of this on stock. There. Now even more yellow. And this is where I'm just going to pick up some of the highlights. We can shade this darker later. We're just, right now, we want to establish what all the colors in general are. So now we have a good idea what the coat's going to look like. The hair, the face. So this brown, whether we make it darker or lighter, well, we can compare it to everything else that we've got. Alright, let's get a little bit of gray on that rifle. And I think this was a Vallejo Intermediate Blue. So here we go, we got the bayonet. And hopefully you can see a little bit of the barrel. Doesn't have to be perfect because again, this all is going to be shaded darker via some glazes. Lighten this up. We're going to take that same U.S. Marine Corps, look at that. So it works. We've lightened our flesh with it. We've lightened our browns with it. We've lightened our greens with it. Now we're actually going to lighten our grays with it. That's why I like to keep a color like this, either off-white, either whether it's more yellow, more pink, more green. The off-white color like this to make things lighter instead of white. Because the off-white, you don't get as chalky. For some reason, when you add pure white, that's what seems to make colors very chalky. Okay, so now we just quickly establish some lights. And looks like the face is kind of dried a little bit, so let's get back to that. Now, I am going to introduce a new color. And speaking of off-white, this is going to be a little bit of Vallejo game color. Look at, there we go. Just a tiny bit of that. Oh, and I hate those squeeze bottles. Okay. So we're back to our brown rose. You can see it's mostly still wet. Now if you want to keep a color from getting too dry, here's a little trick that I have. I save these. Little container that keeps that color from getting too dry. Or, if you have larger ones, can go like this, and that'll keep all of this paint relatively wet, especially if you spray some water in the top. But I want you to see the colors. So let's get back to the face. You can see we have a slightly lighter color. We're going to go to the middle of the face again, right here. I'm just going to concentrate on that front part of the face. And there's that near dry brush again. It's not quite a dry brush. There's a fair amount of pigment on the brush, but because we have soft bristles and it's kind of a wide flat surface, that's going to let us gently apply. And we go back again. And here I'm going to pull out the eyes a little bit so I can just see where they are. We're going to do some more stuff to them. That just lets me, okay, here's the basic shape of these eyes. So we got the ears. I'm going to pull those out. You can see I'm trying to make sure that our flesh doesn't get too bright. And again, we're going to be toning these things down afterwards. Okay, so we're going to stop for now, and we're going to come back and we're going to work some more on our greens. To work on our greens, I'm going to introduce a few new tools, a few new concepts. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with these Games Workshop, I guess they call them shades now. I still refer to them as glazes. Most people call them washes. Typically, I'm going to refer to it as a glaze. And this is another little favorite of mine. It's called Brown Liner. This comes from Reaper. I know they have the brown, they have a blue, a dark blue, and they have a gray. Those are really nice because while they're very dark and very thin, they work really nicely with liner brushes. So when I pull out my Winsor Newton brush here, you can see this is really great for freehand in particular, but this is what we're going to use to kind of pick out the eyes and put the detail in the eyes. And remember that kind of beat up liner brush that I told you all about? Let's see if you can see it here. Now to me, this is a very beat up brush. Well, these don't get thrown away. I save these for just this purpose. Because we want to get darks in all these different areas here, because we worked almost from middle tone. Now how do we get some darks? We're going to take some of this Nuln oil here. We're going to mix it together with a bit of that green shade. So just like we did with our opaque paints, we can do the same thing with our glazes. This is pure black, it's almost a pure green, and then we have a little bit of a range in between. So let's do the underside of the helmet. We're going to shade this darker. The reason I use this beat up brush is that this glazing stage, using a small brush like this, well, it's really rough on the brushes. You really don't want to use your fine, brand new liner brushes for this process. Alright, underside of the helmet. Now let's get some of these areas on his jacket, under his arm, and you can see it's not the typical wash that you see where you just take a big brush, fill it with glaze, wash, whatever, and you just plop it over the whole miniature. No, this is very controlled, and you can see that I even remove some of it either with my thumb or with the brush. So it's much more control. We're actually going to leave our highlights where they were. It takes a little less time this way because now we don't have to go back in and repaint every single highlight. Now we want this area here where his neck is in between there. Well, I'm going to take my liner paint, some of my green, mix these together, and we're going to do this. We're going to designate that space between the face and the coat. And because it's mostly still liquid, it's going to drop down into that recess. There we go. Now for the underside, we're going to go even more. Just pure brown, or brown liner, with that green glaze. Hopefully you can see this. The brown liner is pretty intense. It's a little more intense than a glaze color. I just want to be aware of that. Alright, so there we go. Now, I'm going to take this brown liner, and we can thin it down. I'm going to use it almost like a glaze, or where the boots are. Back to our green glaze again. And you can do this multiple times. Once it dries, if you feel you want your green a little bit darker, you can go over it again. And you can even have it go over your browns. And this area right here in between the collar and his arm. Okay. So as our darks on the green have a chance to dry, a little on the pants, and let's get back to the eyes. Now I'm actually going to use a little different brush here. I'm going to go back to a finer Winsor Newton brush. Go back to our flesh tone. Gonna mix a little bit of a dark. Our eyes are gonna start out. There we go. A little bit of a dark around them, like that, so you can see around this eye. We've added most of our dark shade. Let's put a little bit on the mouth here. See that a little darker. There we go. While we wait for that to dry, let's go back to the hair. Because now the hair is a little more dry. So let's get to some lights on the hair. And I can see I'm picking out where I want my lighter areas to be. We're still going to shade this a little darker, just like we did with the coat. But like we did with the coat, we're going to establish where our lights are. And on the front, there we go. Still have a little bit of our off-white left. I always try to keep a little water out in the palette, so let's pick out a few hairs on the back to make those light. The front. While we have this light color, let's go back in and hit the eye. So you can see that's really beginning to stand out now. Do a little highlight on this hair. There we go. And do a little lights on that. And as we let some of this dry, we'll be ready for our next stage. Now we're going to get back to our eyes, but before I do that, I want to show you another little trick. So that same little container lid, see I've filled it up with water. I like to keep these handy, especially with my palette here, so I don't have to always go back to the jar of water. I can just be here and get my water even closer, right where I need it. Just like this. And you won't believe how much that can save you your colors from drying. Just those few little seconds. I'm gonna add a little touch of an ivory here to the palette. And see, we've got a really fine Winsor Newton brush. And let's work on this eye right here. So there's our lightest parts of the eye. A little bit of highlight there while we're here, waiting for that to dry just a tad bit. I'm going to go some yellow on his eyebrow. There we go. Now, that brown liner paint that I told you about, that is perfect for just this moment. We're going to take his eyelid. Now, normally you don't have to do this on a miniature, but here we do, just the nature of it. So we're going to draw in the eyelid. And then we're going to put in a pupil. So he's looking this way. So you have our eyelid, you have our iris slash pupil right there. Same thing on this side. Draw in the eyelid. And work a little bit on these eyebrows, make sure they have a tiny bit of a shadow area. So all of a sudden he has a little bit more of an expression on his face. And once you have those dots established, you can go in with your white. We want to make sure we have the whites of the eye. Now we want to do a little tiny highlight on the eye. Hopefully you can see that right there. A little bit on his mouth. The other eye. A little highlight on the eyebrow. Highlight on the hair. Okay. So let's, while we have this light color out, let's put some highlights on the metal parts of the gun. Bayonet. Highlighting all the surfaces here on the barrel. Other side of the bayonet. Yes, I shook the camera. That happens because we're very active painters. Alright, we have this little belt buckle down here. Don't want to forget that. A few little buttons. Those. Alright. Now we've still got the brown cartridge cases, belt. Now back to the brown liner. And just because of the nature of this miniature, in some ways it's a little bit easier. Now we just pick that out by drawing that out. That's what we're going to do on all two of these pouches with my really thin Winsor Newton liner brush. I like the liner brushes because unlike the spotters, you can get a lot of paint. They just hold more paint. When you water it down, they tend to have a little more control. The spotters, there's some things they do well, but to me, I just prefer the liner brushes. Okay, a little designation on the hands there. The barrel, a little dark there. Okay, now the underside of the helmet, there's parts of that I want even darker. So our initial wash dried. You can see I've got that brown liner back to the green glaze. And in the front of the face and the back of the head, you can see I'm going to do this. Most people probably aren't really going to see this. I just want to create a little bit of a transition there. We're going to do the same thing on the back of the helmet. Hopefully you can see this. Okay, so there we go. That same dark color. I'm going to use it to shade around these belt things here, in this area, behind the arm, next to the body. So again, you can do multiple levels of glazing, not just one glaze and be done. You can do 2, 3, 4, however many it takes. And you can see that a couple layers of thin glazing takes less time than all of those laborious, careful layers of opaque paint. Okay, so you can see we've got almost all of our darks in now. So what we're going to do, once all the darks are in, most of the middle tones are in, now we can add a few highlights here and there. What I want to do is back to this belt loop here. So I'm going to go back to my brown. I'm going to use brown and flesh tone together to lighten that up just a bit. You can see, staying with that really limited palette. Fewer colors, easier to remember. So here we go, back to the belt. And just like the face, how the face is lighter here, it gets darker back here. Belt's going to get lighter here, darker back here. Little pouches. Same thing. This front part of the belt. You can even go a little bit more with the flesh tone into the brown. See that same transition, light to dark, light to dark, cartridge case, these straps. You can see how handy it is to have my little water jug right here. This is actually a very transparent color here. It is not very opaque at all. So you can see we've got a lighter color on top of the cartridge box. And the cartridge box is shaded dark. Because we have some reflected light here. This is our highlight edge. Reflected light works its way up to dark. So we need to do the same thing here that we did on the face and the belt on the other side. So we're gonna there. Brown liner, just to, oh, look at that. Wow, a terrible mistake is now gone. Now, we're going to let that kind of settle a little bit, and we're going to get back to the hair and put a few darks into the hair. I just introduced a new glaze to the palette. This is a GW Agrax Earthshade. It's a little bit of a sepia brown type color. It's going to work well for our hair, for our eyebrows, and we'll even do a little bit of shading on the face and on the gun with it. So here we go. to the back of that, and we're not gonna, again, this is not about a giant swath of wash. This is about selective areas. See, I've left most of these areas alone. I'm just painting in these darkest areas. The hair, there we go. Also on the eyebrow, there's a little more form to it. Same thing over here. You can see how controlled this is. Because I've already got where my highlights are. I don't want to bury those highlights. There's places where I may want to tone those down, and that's what I can do at this stage. There we go, a little more designation of the face. We can take this. We want to warm up maybe some of the shadows on the stock of his gun. So there we go. And if you want to do a little more on belts and pouches here, you can do that. And see, I didn't do the whole thing. All I did was just this little top third right here. That's all I did. Underside of the hair. I like to do this intentionally. Actually is put my wash down, take the finger, and it wipes away the areas I want to preserve, and it keeps it in the areas where I want the glaze to stay. And why am I letting this warm glaze get onto the jacket? Well, I just want to vary the color a little bit. I don't want it to get too boring. I want it to be the exact same shade of green. So by doing this area is going to be a little warmer, this is going to be a little cooler, a little warmer, this is going to be a little cooler. This is facing up towards the sky, so it's good that this is not as warm as some of the rest of the parts of the coat. You can see this is also lighter than the coat because this is going to catch more light. Let's see if we can get ourselves a little bit of a highlight on the hands here. Such as they are. There we go. It's back to the face. Let's get a little bit of a... There we go. I'm going to establish a little bit of lights here around his eyes. Again, this is kind of a flat surface, so we have to, in a way, kind of create something that's not there. Okay, and there we go. Not too many more things to do. I'm going to highlight the edge of this belt, of that strap, and actually using the flesh color with just a little bit of our green mixed in. And I'll highlight this strap, this belt, cartridge case. You can see this all starts to kind of come out now. Now if we want to put a rank on him, we can go private, corporal, whatever. Let's just make him a private for now. So I mix my white and that tan, and we get a private stripe there. Another one on this side. Use the same. Did a little highlight there. I like sometimes on my cool gray surfaces here, if I'm going to highlight them, sometimes I will highlight those actually with a warm color like a yellow instead of just adding more white to the blue. More white to the blue, sometimes that gives them a little more of a pop. So okay, we're going to let this dry a little bit, and our next thing we're going to do is our little symbol here, our little logo, and then some of our weathering and chipping. Now we've got the colors out on the palette so that we can do our little symbol right here. We're going to start out, we're going to block in the shape, the overall shape with some dark, put the star in, and then we'll do our little red outline. So let's get to that. We have our small liner brush, we have our brown liner paint. You can see I'm going to balance thumb, finger, and I'm just going to rough in the circle. So let me know just how much space I have to work with. See, it's pretty transparent. I'm just going to leave that be. And as that dries, I'm going to put in some of my other areas where I want the paint to be chipped away. So we're going to kind of focus on top part of the helmet. That's where paint would be chipped away. Also anywhere you don't like, okay, say there's a rough transition here where we're going to do some of these paint chips here. Same thing along, especially brim of the helmet. And try to be as random as possible. Don't you want to place these things as irregularly as possible and make the shapes as irregular as possible. Alright, that's dry. We go back to our white. Sometimes flow improver really helps at this stage. We're going to go with the brush we've got and some water. We have our thin down paint. And we're going to block in our star. Remember, I want to leave something around the edge for our red. One way to keep the star even, I'm going to turn this upside down. Hopefully you can see that. I'm going to work on the star from a few different angles. There we go. And while I've got my lighter colors here, take some of those paint chips that we did. See, we've got these 3-4 chips here. What I'm going to do is on the undersides of each of those with some thin down paint. We're going to do this on the underside of those chips. So it actually looks like the paint has been chipped away. So let's do this one here. Few along the sides of the helmet. Alright, we have this light color. A little bit on the belt there. A little bit on the gun. Pull out this collar. And now, star is dry. We have some red out on the palette. It's pretty much any red you can use just about anything, a blood red, whatever. This looks like it's Vallejo flat red. So okay, we're gonna do our thing where we're gonna get our miniature in a solid spot and our brush on the finger. I'm going to work our way around the star. And if that red is a little bit too cool, I'm going to introduce a bit of yellow to it. I'm going to do at the top of the symbol. Hopefully you can see this. There we go. I'm going to go back to my brown liner paint. That's dry, so let's add a little more. There we go. And I'm going to clean up the star. And our red line, and we're going to outline very, very thin. Very thin around the edge. So now we have our symbol. We have our little rust spots, or our paint chips here, which we're going to add some rust to in our next stage. So, next stage, we add a little bit of rust to this guy. Now I put down a new color onto the palette so that we can do our rust. And that is a GW, it's a foundation paint, it's called Kelthan Brown. There's any number of paints that would do the exact same thing. What I've done is I've mixed a lot of water with that Kelthan Brown, and we're going to add rust, especially to our helmet here. And again, this paint is very, very thin. See, it's almost like a wash. And if you want, you can remove it. That's the nice thing about using it almost as a wash, so you can see in the recesses of the helmet here. It's almost like a wash. Not going to do that everywhere. I'll leave some areas where that doesn't happen, and I'm going to take some of my paint chips and have the rust come down from those paint chips. Have a little rust over our symbol there. Give it a little more aging. Use this same color on part of the stock. Rust spots on the helmet, and I can take my fingers, since they are just such a transparent wash, I can remove those if I want. Put a little rust on the blade, the stock of the gun. And just for fun, I think I'm going to put a little scar on his face on this side. My thin brush. A bit of my liner paint. A bit of blood that comes down from his scar. Tiny bit on the shirt. And I'm going to look for a few little things around. I got around outline. Our little private stripes here. On his other arm. So there you have your Rivet Warrior. And you can put them on your base. Using the same technique, just a base painted gray, a few light highlights. We did the same thing with the rust, very transparently.